Hello, and welcome to Nonprofit Program Planning and Evaluation. I'm Charles McElveen, and this is Lesson 3, Theory of Change Outcomes, Indicators, and Assumptions. There are 3 outcomes for this lesson. The first is that you will be able to establish a causal logic outcome pathway that, when you fulfill it, can lead to a program's overarching goal or purpose. The second outcome is that you will be able to incorporate the means by which you can provide measurable evidence that your outcome has been achieved. Lastly, you will be able to appraise existing conditions or resources needed for the success of a program. Now, this last bullet, the essence of appraising conditions or resources, is to identify the assumptions that drive your program hypothesis. The program, once implemented, tests the design, and if it works as intended, establishes your theory of change. First, let's take a look at outcomes and outcome objectives. The first thing I want you to know is that there's variation within the program planning space of what we mean by these terms. Sometimes you will read or hear the term outcome. Sometimes you're going to hear objectives. And yet, other times, you're going to hear the term outcome objectives. For this course, we'll use the terms synonymously, and I'm going to default back to the term outcome. And the reason I do that is it remains consistent for me. I always know what I'm talking about when I'm using the phrase outcome. And just like it's important to me to always use the same term, it should be important to you also that you're able to articulate and defend what you mean when you say any of these terms. There are subtle differences, and they're more like nuances. As I get deeper into the program here, I'll be able to flesh that out a little bit more for you. The thing that I want you to really get is that when you're using the term, ensure these things. Number one, that you're focusing on your participant, because it is outcomes based, that it is measurable, and following that it is something that's actually measured. A third point here is it's appropriate for the level of program in which it is used. Fourth, it's achievable. And lastly, it is aligned with higher level mission, goals, and outcomes. And I put in parentheses there, objectives as well. There are some other interchangeable terms that you're going to come across in the reading. And this is especially when you're going back and forth between the Kettner volume and the Kellogg Logic Model Development Guide. In some places they're used interchangeably, and other times they're not. And here's an example, or 2 more examples. The first one is inputs and resources. Depending on who you're reading, some of the text will lump resources and the activities into the same category called input. Some places they don't. In other places it's very specific. An input is a resource only, and then activity is something different. So inputs and resource is something to watch out for. A second one is activities, process objectives, and throughput. Oftentimes you will see these also doubling or tripling up on their definitions. Let's look at a couple of examples. In this slide from Kettner, the authors have taken their definition and they have grafted it or laid it over the logic model, the Kellogg logic model specifically. And so you can see here in outcomes, they term it outcome objective. Outputs is a documentation of a completion process, and we're going to use outputs. Here with process, we're actually going to use this phrase activities. And then inputs is going to be both of these items here, clients or consumers. In our case, it's going to be participants. And then the resources to address problem or need, whether it's staffing or space, utilities, etc. all the way over here on the right-hand side, you've got impact and documentation of change in problem or need. This category over here really is reserved for systemic or community level change. Not something that we're going to address specifically in this course, but it is nevertheless a long-term outcome that you may be striving for within your community. So the idea is that as each of your participants is able to become more stable, eventually that will drive the overall stability level up within your community, which you could then talk about as far as impact. Just as a heads up, impact is going to be a 5 or a 10-year process. It's going to take a long time to get there, so it's going to take a lot of patience and education on your part to make sure that your stakeholders understand that point. Next, let's look at the outcomes pathways. Outcomes pathways really is a if-then sequence. It's a logic sequence. The first thing I'd like you to know about this is that the relationships within the outcomes pathways, they all lead to the acceptance of the outcome or the achievement of the outcome on the basis of the satisfaction of a set of preconditions. So we talked about that in the previous lesson, how we layer preconditions. So the point here is that as you think about these items here in this example, a long-term outcome is dependent on an intermediate outcome. That intermediate outcome is a satisfactory completion or a precondition for the long-term outcome. And that in turn, this intermediate outcome is dependent on this short-term outcome. So you could say, working backwards, that the short-term outcome is a precondition for the intermediate outcome, which is a precondition for the long-term outcome. And here, the short-term outcome depends upon completion of an activity. And that activity is a precondition for the achievement of the short-term outcome. The activity itself depends upon the resources available to it, and those are preconditions. So do I have the staff to do this activity? Do I have the space to do this activity? Do I have the support I need to conduct this activity? Don't overlook the fact that the participants themselves are a resource. And you can even drill down another layer under that. And a precondition of your participants is that they're ready, willing, and able to even participate in the program. For instance, if you want someone to complete alcohol rehab, perhaps a precondition is that they have completed detox. So that's a really important, necessary precondition to get you to the point where they're even able to participate in the activity. Here's an example of what all these, all these preconditions are going to look like. And here's an example from the Phoenix Rescue Mission. And you'll note here, there are all different elements here, moving vertically. So reach community engagement. So this organization, they want to meet the basic needs and engage for rescue. So all this is all about getting someone to the point where they can get to here, which is rescue. And here they're working on this short-term residential program. And you can see their whole process for bringing people in to that short-term residential process and how it may look from beginning to end, which leads them, once they're all done with this, it leads them to recovery. And you can see here how a person may work at the top from phase 1 down to phase 2 into phase 3. And then when it's time to move out into society, we have reentry, and that's your transitional and your housing programs. And you can see that each one of those programs has got a method of how it engages the process to get back out into the community. There really is no one perfect way to document your process, except for the process that you develop and is meaningful for you. So throughout this course, you're going to see various ways and examples in which people go about their documentation process. The key that I want you to take away from this slide is how deliberate and how intentional this process is as they think about the outcome pathway or the logic pathway in their program design. Another element to look at is the measurable evidence, and that's one of your outcomes for this lesson. So when we talk about measurable evidence, primarily we're talking outcome indicators. And the indicator trackers are means by which you track the outcome indicators. So how do you know a person is moving from short term to an intermediate term to a long term outcome? It's dependent upon these indicators. An example here is the measurable evidence that a participant is achieving short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes of the program. It's pretty simple definition. An outcome indicator indicates the achievement of an outcome. Let me give you a real tight example. Here it is. 75% of program participants will remain financially solvent as defined by Investopedia for 24 months after program completion. You've got numerics going on in here. There's the rate. 75% of whom? Program participants. What about the 75%? They're going to remain financially solvent. Well, what does financially solvent mean? It could mean one thing to mean another to you. So we say as defined by Investopedia. So that's a universal standard that we're going to adopt that says, here's what we mean by financially solvent. This is going to be the standard or the benchmark that we're going to compare ourselves against. And what's the time period? The time period here is 24 months when after program completion. So there's a lot packed in there, but that is an example of an outcome indicator. This is actually going to be a long-term outcome, by the way, because you're talking 24 months out after program completion. And being financially solvent is specifically a change in a person's condition, not their attitude, skill, or knowledge, or their behavior. It's a change in condition. Now, you may be wondering, how am I going to track all those elements? Here's some different ways you can track it. You can use case management software, and there are many versions out there. I'm not sure which your organization is going to use, but take a look at that and talk to the person on your staff that's responsible for these databases. And I'm going to assume, I know that's a dangerous word, that they're going to be able to pull out statistics for you, and many of these applications are able to be contextualized. They're able to be customized for your particular organization. Another example is Microsoft Access or Microsoft Excel. That's another way you can track your indicator completion. That one you'll need a little bit more skill on, but it is an opportunity. It is a way that you can track your indicators. And probably the most simple form is just a paper and pen or a pencil, and keeping track of tick marks and periodically, putting those into a spreadsheet possibly, or just simply counting and making reports of them. So when we talk about measurable evidence, this is what we're talking about. You're able to very specifically say, here's the indicator. So something that you have, an outcome that is measurable, and that you're actually measuring it and monitoring it down here in the trackers. Your third outcome for this lesson is about appraising existing conditions and resources. And what I use is this good old SWOT diagram here from the business sector. Pardon me. So there's many different methods you could use. There's one called a PEST survey. This is a SWOT. There's also a TOWS, T-O-W-S. So there's different ways you can go about this. I'm just going to use this one because this is the one that I am most familiar with. So appraising the existing conditions, the first thing is to know that this whole deal, the cornerstone of effective planning, is identifying your assumptions. So before you even think about launching a program or design a program, you take a look at what you assume to be your conditions. Well, I'm going to launch this program, and I assume I'm going to do it based upon my strengths. Here, it could be a strengthened staff. What is the organization doing well? Do others people say that we are doing well? By identifying our weaknesses. This one maybe not so much, but the thing to note here is that by zeroing in on your strengths and not trying to do something out of a weakness is going to be the best way to go. And then what are our opportunities? Now the thing to know about opportunities is that's going to be external to you, usually external to your environment. But what are the things out there that you can take advantage of using your strengths? Now that's the key there, is coupling your strengths to your opportunities. That's where you're going to have the most robust program development and support, are connecting those two things. Even if you talk about weaknesses, perhaps the weaknesses that you have is the ability to develop curriculum. However, there's a lot of great curriculum out there, when I say out there, external to you, maybe through cityvisioncurriculum.org or cityvisioninstitute.org, that you could buy relatively inexpensively and bring that into your program, and therefore be able to augment one of your weaknesses by seizing this opportunity. The last one is threats. What are the things that could harm you that may not make this program work? A significant threat could be if the government all of a sudden starts adding more cash into community block grants with different programs, and people and participants start going into that direction versus your program. That is a threat, but it could also be an opportunity if there's dollars there for faith-based initiatives. This exercise is going to help you identify the assumption that drives your program's hypothesis. If you can identify each one of these assumptions, you're going to be able to address each one of these assumptions in the building of your program. One of the biggest blind spots that program developers have is the inability to identify the assumptions that they carry regarding their program, how it's going to be accepted, how people will be able to graduate, how they'll be able to raise dollars. So this is going to be a great exercise that you should probably be doing in concert with other people, other program staff, organizational staff, even bringing in other stakeholders to help you get through this, because this is a pretty big driver of whether your program is going to succeed or not, whether you're able to adequately identify all your assumptions. Okay, that's it for Lesson 3, and we will be seeing you next up in Lesson 4.